Sidekick here with another episode of Moving Mud, the iron bombing podcast. This is episode 23, The Rise of the Tonkin Gulf Yacht Club. In case you missed the reference, this episode is about the U.S. Navy, specifically U.S. Navy aviation and the role it played in the Vietnam War. I know it's been a while since I released one of these podcast episodes. I do apologize for that. Those of you who do remember will recall that we had spent a few episodes talking about the United States Air Force and its war in North Vietnam. I think those episodes had proceeded far enough along the narrative arc that it was time to back up a bit and talk about the other U.S. Air Force that fought a war in the North. And that, of course, was the U.S. Navy's aviation. Now, I say fought a war rather than joined the war, because honestly, sometimes it's hard to realize that the United States Air Force and the United States Navy were actually fighting the same war. They quite literally did not mix in the skies over North Vietnam. It seems like about the only time they ever got together was trying to save one another's downed pilots. Other than that, even though they might strike targets almost within sight of one another in any given 24-hour period, they really could not have done less to collaborate in the process. And what's more, the Navy's war did unfold quite differently than the United States Air Force's did. Honestly, about the only thing they had in common was the target list, which they both received from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is about the only command level where there was any genuine regular liaison, at least from what I can tell. The Navy came into the fight with a different doctrine, and so with different training and different tactics than the Air Force. They flew different airplanes, mostly. Now, the Air Force and the Navy did both fly the F-4, but they had different models, and while the Air Force used theirs extensively for ground attack, the Navy only ever used theirs for combat air patrol. So in terms of, aircraft hitting targets on the ground, they used different aircraft. To some extent, they even used different ordnance in that the Navy had anti-radiation missiles, and the Air Force did not, at least at the beginning of the conflict. And the Air Force had been developing an armory of precision-guided munitions, like with laser-guided bombs, definitely progressing and becoming really part of a standard loadout in Vietnam. But the Navy never really used precision-guided munitions to the same extent. The two services also had completely different approaches as to how frontline squadrons were staffed and organized and how pilots were rotated through those squadrons on tours of duty. So, yes, it really is worth backing the truck, or in this case the boat, up and taking a look at how the Navy prepared for and got itself into the air war in North Vietnam. Now, note, I am being careful to say air war in North Vietnam, because there was an air war in South Vietnam as well, but it was a very different kind of war, as we'll eventually talk about in this series. More to the point, though, the Navy never really participated in the air war in the South. That part of the job was left to the Navy's other Air Force, United States Marine Corps aviation. Almost all of the Marine Corps effort in the air was focused on the South, because that's where the troops were. And any Marine will tell you that Marine Corps aviation has always existed firstly and primarily to support the troops on the ground. So, in Vietnam, the Marines got the job of supporting both Marines and Army troops in the South, and the Navy went to work with the Air Force trying to convince the North Vietnamese that fomenting a rebellion in the Republic of Vietnam in the South was not really worth it, especially if it meant taking on U.S. air power. Now, and in point of fact, it actually was the Navy that added the final weight that pushed the cart over the edge from supporting the South to attacking the North. That tipping point is sometimes usually called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This was an incident that was really pivotal to how the Vietnam War progressed. It happened in August of 1964. It involved two separate encounters between U.S. Navy destroyers and North Vietnamese forces in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is off the coast of North Vietnam. On August the 2nd, 1964, the USS Maddox was conducting a signals intelligence mission in the Gulf when it was reportedly attacked by three North Vietnamese torpedo boats The Maddox fired warning shots, which led to a brief exchange of fire. No American sailors were injured, and only minor damage was inflicted on the Maddox, while one of the North Vietnamese boats was damaged and 4 crew members were killed. The encounter was relatively minor, but it set the stage for what followed. 2 days later, on August the 4th, the Maddox, now joined by the USS Turner Joy, reported a second attack in the same area. However, there was a lot of confusion regarding this. I'm going to have to call it an alleged incident. Radar and sonar readings were unclear, and reports later called into question, wondering whether there was even an attack at all. But despite the ambiguity, the Maddox and the Turner Joy were convinced that they had been attacked again by the North Vietnamese. And when these reports reached Washington, the Johnson administration used them to justify a much more aggressive stance against Vietnam. And on August the 7th, 1964, the U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This resolution authorized the president to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against U.S. forces and to prevent further aggression, effectively giving Johnson a blank check to escalate the American military involvement in Vietnam. In the aftermath of these incidents, President Johnson ordered a retaliatory airstrike on North Vietnamese targets, marking the first direct U.S. military action against North Vietnam. The airstrikes were dubbed Operation Pierce Arrow, and they targeted North Vietnamese naval bases and fuel depots. The operation involved 64 strike aircraft from the carriers USS Ticonderoga and Constellation. The raids resulted in the destruction or damage of a number of North Vietnamese patrol boats and some of the oil storage facilities, for the loss of 2 of the strike aircraft. So, this was the first use of American air power against North Vietnam, and it was the Navy that did the striking. Now, how effective it was kind of depends on where you're standing and which way the wind is blowing, so to speak. And in some ways, the conundrum is, the one that would haunt the U.S. throughout Vietnam, I think. And to be fair, it's the one that had haunted the U.S. Navy through the final years of the Korean conflict as well. Let me explain what I mean. The pilots in the strike certainly reported that the strike had been very successful, claiming 24 patrol boats destroyed, and as much as 10% of the North Vietnamese oil reserves had gone up in smoke. In short, the raid was seen as a very clear example of the destructive potential of even a relatively small amount of U.S. air power. And surely this would awe the North Vietnamese into respecting the United States. Never again would they choose to go toe-to-toe with the superpower. Clearly, that superpower had the ability to inflict this amount of damage in a single raid, so U.S. air power would be able to bring North Vietnamese quickly to its knees if it needed to. Right? Right? Well, not so much. At a military tactical and operational level, the Pierce Arrow raids were definitely a success. They proved that the Navy could deploy force flexibly and responsively, and that pilots, planes, and ordnance could deliver an impressive amount of firepower wherever and whenever they wanted to. But at a strategic and political level, the Pierce Arrow raids were either ineffective or maybe even counterproductive, depending on how you look at it. In the end, the damage done to the North Vietnamese Navy was kind of inconsequential, since the North Vietnamese really didn't intend or need to challenge the U.S. Navy for control of the sea. Likewise, the damage to the oil storage facilities was impressive, and it certainly sounded consequential. But as the Navy and the Air Force were to find out over the next 8 long years, dismantling or disabling the petroleum, oil, and lubricant storage and distribution system in North Vietnam was going to be a lot harder than it looked. And just like the United States Army Air Force had discovered over Germany and then over Japan in World War II, and as the Navy had discovered in Korea, the first response of a country that cannot guarantee that it can defend critical assets from air attack is to move, disperse, protect, and camouflage those assets to make air attacks against them increasingly costly while also making them increasingly ineffective. And having demonstrated what they could do to an unprepared target of high value, the Navy essentially convinced the North Vietnamese not to make that mistake again if they could avoid it. And so, in the year between Pierce Arrow and Rolling Thunder, and in all of the years after that, the North Vietnamese worked hard not only at preparing their critical assets and protecting them, they also worked hard at dispersing those assets and in developing ways to repair them quickly when they were damaged or destroyed. And in this, they were very ably assisted by their communist brethren in North Korea, who had had to develop those very same skills in their own confrontation with American air power. In point of fact, when I look at the United States Navy in 1964, as the big air war over North Vietnam was getting set to kick off, it feels kind of like naval aviation went kind of through some kind of time warp or wormhole from the end of Korea to the start of serious combat operations in Vietnam. Things really hadn't changed that much. I mean, they ended Korea doing missions that were designed to destroy infrastructure and interdict supplies. They had a lot of experience flying those missions. But at the end, in 1953, they were finding that it was becoming much more of a challenge. Targets were getting harder, they were getting harder to hit, and they were much better defended. So, immediately following Korea, the Navy set out to improve its ability to perform those tasks. Specifically, they set out to find a replacement for their aging Corsairs and to some extent their Skyraiders. The quest would eventually lead into the A4, and we've talked about that in earlier episodes, like episode 11 and 12. But something happened on the way to the ball, as the saying goes. Immediately after the Korean conflict, well, even while it was ending, the Navy found itself confronted with the doctrine of massive retaliation, for which there was very little home for naval aviation. For much of the 1950s, therefore, the Navy sort of found itself fighting a rearguard action to preserve its carrier force against the United States Air Force predators roaming the halls of the Pentagon and Congress. Now, the Navy did this in part by trying desperately to find a role for aviation in the business of delivering nuclear strikes. And of course, they also spent a lot of effort trying to find an aircraft that would fill that role. As a result, over the course of certainly the late 1950s, most of the design effort for naval aircraft went into looking for heavy bombers or high-level, high-speed bombers with very specialized capabilities. The effort did not go into developing a true attack aircraft that was in any way a replacement or an improvement on the A4. Now, most of these specialized designs that were where the effort went ended up surviving the 1950s, but only to be repurposed as electronic warfare or reconnaissance platforms, when the doctrine of massive retaliation was replaced by flexible response, which gave the Navy back its role of power projection and conventional tactical attack. So, after a decade of experimenting with trying to make carrier aviation part of the nuclear deterrent, the Navy found itself in 1964 pretty much back where they'd been in 1953 in terms of the role of aviation. The surprising thing about it was that the Navy, had lost a lot of that institutional memory of how to conduct those kinds of operations because they'd spent 10 years preparing and practicing for a completely different set of missions. Now, the institutional memory wasn't gone, though, but most of it resided in pretty senior officers, squadron commanders, but particularly even air group commanders and even carrier captains. But it has to be said that the Navy was in better shape in this respect than the Air Force, which had basically had its tactical conventional bombing expertise starved out of existence in the 1950s. So what was the state of naval aviation in, say, 1964? Well, the Navy entered the Vietnam conflict with a attack carrier force consisting of 10 ships. These consisted of 3 older Essex-class carriers that had been significantly upgraded, including with the addition of angled flight decks and steam catapults, which are essential for operating jet aircraft. They also had 6 newer, larger carriers of the Forrestal and Kitty Hawk classes. And they had 1 nuclear-powered supercarrier, the very first of its breed, the USS Enterprise. Now, the Navy had continued to operate some older Essex-class carriers, but it operated them as anti-submarine warfare carriers, and these were mainly in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. And as far as I know, they weren't capable of operating jet aircraft. In terms of aircraft, by 1964, the standard carrier air groups consisted of a mix of attack squadrons and fighter squadrons, as well as usually a detachment of specialized aircraft like reconnaissance and electronic warfare platforms. The attack squadrons were a mix between A4s and a few remaining A1 Sky Raiders that were in the process of being phased out. The fighter squadrons were mainly made up of F-8 Crusaders, which, if you remember the earlier episodes of this podcast, was the product of a great deal of experimentation during the 1950s to find a high-performance jet fighter that could also operate from a carrier. In addition, there were a few squadrons of F-4 Phantoms being stood up. It's kind of important to realize, though, that the F-8 and the F-4 really represented the opposite ends of the fighter design philosophy, since they were really designed for two very different jobs. The F-8 was very much a continuation of previous Navy fighters like the Wildcats and Hellcats and Corsairs of World War II. Today we would call it an air superiority fighter, maybe. It was designed to protect carriers by intercepting and destroying enemy aircraft before they could close within bombing range. It was also designed to escort and protect attack aircraft on their way to and from targets. The F-8 was basically designed to be a good dogfighter. It was fast, and it was maneuverable, and it was armed with cannon. But it was very much an in-visual range fighter because it didn't have any onboard radar. It would rely on the carrier radar to vector the F-8s to their actual targets in the air. In contrast, the F-4 was developed for a very different mission, and this is because with the advent of flexible response, the Navy now had to plan for the possibility of a conventional war in Europe. And in that eventuality, one of their primary jobs was going to have to be to keep the sea lanes open between North America and Europe. Now, the principal threats to these sea lanes were Soviet submarines, hence the number of anti-submarine warfare carriers, and Soviet long-range bombers. Now, these bombers were increasingly being armed with standoff missiles, which would mean that they could deliver potentially killing strikes from beyond the visual range of their targets. In order to counter this threat, the Navy needed a fleet defense fighter that could engage those bombers before they could launch their missiles. The F-4 was designed to fill this need. It was capable of getting up and out from the carrier very quickly. It had, really, the very first airborne intercept radar, and it was armed with air-to-air missiles that were able to shoot down targets well beyond visual range, at least in theory. Now, as we have and will see, the F-4 had some limitations in this role. In many ways, it was the first step on the road to the quintessential fleet defense fighter, which I would say was the F-14. But in 1964, it represented a set of capabilities that no other aircraft of the day could match. Unfortunately, the North Vietnamese did not cooperate because they provided a threat that was not the one the F-4 was designed to defeat, but we'll talk about that later, and probably in some detail. For now, though, I just want to wrap up this episode by summarizing where the Navy was on the eve of the real air war over North Vietnam. As we have seen, the U.S. Air Force found itself completely unprepared for the job they'd be asked to do starting in the summer of 1965. They didn't have the aircraft, ordnance, or pilots with the right training and experience to mount the kind of sustained, let's call it what it was, strategic bombing campaign that they would be asked to perform against the kind of opposition they were going to encounter. Now, the Navy was a little better off, I think it's fair to say. While the kinds of missions they would be required to fly might not have been their main focus for a number of years, they were pivoting back to accepting that role, and it was very much a mission that had been the Navy's bread and butter in times past. Unlike the Air Force, the Navy also welcomed a return to that role, which the Air Force clearly did not. That being said, though, the lack of experience in the mission would make itself felt in due course, as we'll see. Although, in some ways, the Navy approached the problem more constructively, I'd say, than the Air Force did. As a top-to-bottom organization, it really was a problem that they had not considered for 10 years or more, and their thinking was pretty far out of date, though, particularly when it came to understanding the threats they would face. The Navy was still thinking in terms of manually guided AAA as the primary threat, and they were also assuming that they could surprise the enemy, both in terms of the location and timing of their strikes. And they really were not prepared for the ubiquitous presence of radar, both long-range search radar and guidance radar for AAA of all calibers. Finally, as with the Air Force, they really had no idea what it was going to be like to confront a layered, integrated air defense system that included a very large number of radar-guided surface-to-air missiles. And they were about to find out. And we'll talk about that in the next episode. Hopefully it will not take me so long to get that one done. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.